This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm Dahlia Shendlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about their books and research and things that we find fascinating and essential. If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us because we're counting on you. This episode is brought to you by the Israel Democracy Institute, a longtime partner, and an independent center of research and action dedicated to strengthening the foundations of Israeli democracy.
Today we are happy to welcome back to the show Edna Harel-Fischer, a research fellow at the Israel Democracy Institute's Center for Religion, Nation and State and the Center for Democratic Values. Prior to joining the IDI, she was a public servant for 25 years, during which time she filled several positions as a legal advisor, most recently as the head of regulatory issues for the Attorney General. Now at the IDI, she carries out research on several issues of government policy and democratic rights, including governance, corruption, public trust in the government, and other topics that we're going to discuss today. Edna Harel-Fischer, welcome back to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you very much.
So governance or governability, and we're going to discuss terminology in a second, it has become somewhat of a controversial issue in Israeli politics. And I'd like to start by trying to understand how and why. Because you define governance or governability as, and I quote, the government's ability to adopt and carry out policy decisions in accordance with the law and within mechanisms that continuously and simultaneously guarantee the rule of law and the professionalism, independence and integrity of the administrative apparatus. End quote. Now, it sounds self-evident, almost banal. Why on earth would governability, according to your definition, be that controversial?
Well, as a matter of fact, I would have loved to be in an atmosphere that it's not controversial, but in the last several years, it is very controversial in Israel, and it has a difficult effects on our governmental sphere. And even our civil rights, as I will explain in a minute. But first, as of definition, governance in Israel is understood to be the power of government ministers, like only the elect government officers, to rule. That's governance.
When you say elected ministers, you mean specifically the executive branch?
Specifically the executive branch, to rule. And what do you mean to rule? To have their own decisions quickly with no interference of professionals or any other people, like maybe judges. And of course, to implement their decisions immediately. Now, of course, ministers, elect politicians are elect to rule. That's true. But in a democratic government, the problem with the way that governance is understood in Israel and is used by the politicians is that it is directed to their immediate implementation of their decisions. And while a democratic government, especially in a modern state, is very complicated. It has different branches, it has lots of experience, things are being checked, you have to know the professional substance of the issues, you have to know like the international affairs situation or implementation or what happened like 10 years ago when we started or tried to walk the same way, the same path, what's our experience, and so on and so forth. And the way that the democratic system is built on is checks and balances. Like you have on one side the experience and the knowledge of the professionals, and on the other side the ideas or the policy that is brought by the elect. And this has to be balanced continuously. And governance, real governance, as OECD, for example, is defining, has this overall look, this combination of professionalism and policy. And of course, listening to the citizens, having participation of the civil society and so on. But even before that, before this very important stage, within the government, this checks and balances between professionals and politicians is very profound essence. And governance, as it is flagged by some of the politicians lately, is something very different. Like, don't bother us with your ideas, you professionals.
Or your
work
knowledge.
within, or your knowledge, or your experience, or even what the law says is sometimes something to bother us. Just change the law so we can do what we were looking for, or we had in mind. And this does not fit a real democracy. It fits more popular regimes, authoritarian regimes. So if you look into real governance, democratic governance, it is based on these different ideas of governance. And as the OECD, for example, defines it, it has 12 principles, not one, not the way I govern immediately and quickly. It is participation, responsiveness, efficiency, openness, rule of law, of course, that you mentioned before, ethical conduct, competence and capacity, innovation, openness to change, and so on. And there are 12 principles of the OECD. And I hope that our new government is heading towards a better understanding and better implementation of governance, as it seems.
We'll see, and I hope so too. But I want to try to clarify a distinction that you make in one of the articles that we've read between what you referred to either as the common good or the public interest, by contrast to the issues that come up from time to time, every day. Why is that distinction so important, and which sides represent the different, or which governing branches or agencies represent the two sides?
Well, it's a very, very delicate issue, the one that you raised. Well, the issue, the common good, which I refer to, is like the basic values of the regime and the way that we wish the government to work in the light of. Like, we expect the government to work according to the rule of law, to be open to the civil society, to be professional, to be ethical, to be honest, and these similar values that are democratic values. And the basic interest of the public is to trust the government that it follows these basic values as it works to check and look for solutions for specific problems that arise. Okay, now, this is the common good. Common good is that we will have trust in the government, that will be honest, that will be fair, that will work according to the rule of law, and will work in a professional way, will dwell into the issues according to science, according to knowledge, to experience that is accumulated within the government branches. And then by its policy and different issues that rise, will check what is the current solution for a current problem. The current solution for a current problem will be also affected, of course, by ideology, by policy, by the way that a specific politician that is right now in position sees the public good. So the public good will be, again, in front of the politician's eye, of course. But it is based on a basic layer.
I think you call it the ground rules, the rules of the game.
Yes, the rules of the game is a notion I used that are overall affecting the work of both layers of the government, like the professional layer and the politician's layer. And these rules of the game are something that can empower the professional layer, someone who works within the public service, in certain situations where, God forbid, a politician is demanding some decisions or actions that are against the rule of law, or are dishonest, or are not based on quality, things like this. So in this sense, there might be a position when someone from the public service that is a public servant will rise the flag of the public interest and tell the politician that his idea is contradicting the public interest. On this sense, I had this argument with some of the other writers on that book that you mentioned before.
Just to say, it's a collected book that was edited by Professor Gael Talshir of the Hebrew University that was a guest here on the Tel Aviv Review a few weeks ago. All our listeners can look it up. Go on.
So, Gil Bringer, which was several years ago working with Ayelet Shaked as she was the Minister of Justice of Israel, he had this other dimension or understanding of the public interest issue. And what he had in mind is that whenever a public servant is using the public interest, it's as if he's trying to rule instead of the politician.
And contradict the will of the voters, right?
And even contradict the will of the voters. And I was trying to argue against this, which, has a very appealing sound. I was trying to contradict this and explain that the will of the voter is to have a politician that will work according to the rule of law, according to the rules of the game, and implement its policy. But not a politician that will, have these ideas and decisions that are just affected by whoever we don't know that affects him, and nothing was checked, and data was not checked, and so on.
It's quite clear-cut when it comes to issues of the law, right? I mean, it's either legal or illegal. I mean, in most cases, of course, it's open to interpretation. But you also spend time saying that part of the role of the public service is also to represent norms, which is more of a grey area. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask you, is it even possible, were there any instances in the past that you can think of that there was a minister who wanted to implement a certain policy decision, and for reasons that are not because it's illegal, but because it contradicts certain norms, the public service struck it down and saying that it's a no-go because it contradicts the public interest or certain norms? I mean, is it even possible? Is it something that happens in the process of governance?
Well, I have to first say something as a lawyer.
Right.
That was also a legal advisor in the government. Many of the legal principles are actually reflecting ideas that have to be implemented by professionals. Like if there's an idea of equality, which is a very strong legal norm, each and every professional understands its own subject and understands what creates equality in this subject. As I was the legal advisor of the Ministry of Culture, equality in music is different than equality in literature. Okay, I could not decide as the legal advisor if things are equal or not when there was a suggestion to divide budgets in a certain way or another. I had to consult the professional person that understands the issue, and he has to explain what are the implementation of equality in this specific area. Now, I can give other examples in safety and health. The professionals have ideas and profound understanding of how to prevent damage to the public. And sometimes a minister that comes with an idea does not understand the implementation of this idea on the interest of the public. I can refer to the previous Minister of Transportation, Miri Regev, as she decided that each and every car that young children are being driven in will have to have a certain kind of equipment that will prevent the driver from forgetting the kid in the car. Now, this sounds, very important, very humane.
Noble, even.
Important.
And we have had some cases of children being forgotten in cars who've died. I mean,
certainly, and
it's a response to a public problem.
In our country, that is such a hot country in the summer times, yes, kids were forgotten and died. It's terrible. But on the other hand, this does not promise that this specific idea that she had is the right idea. On the other hand, professionals that understand the society, that know professionally where these tragic events happened, which population tends to forget kids in the car, could show that these are groups that don't have money to buy this equipment. So it will not help to prevent these tragic events in these groups. It will be very costly for other groups that don't really need that or don't need it at the same degree. And before you take such a decision, especially in a time like this, after the corona crisis, and people don't have excess money and funds to buy equipment, it's better to consult the professionals. And this is an example. So professionals have to raise a flag and say, our responsibility is to look for the right solution for a tragic issue that has to be solved, or we have to help it as much as we can. And this was not legal or illegal. Okay? It was not right professionally. It didn't come after an orderly process.
So in a way, the role of the ministers is to come up with the issue and say we need to address it rather than come up with a solution.
Or if they have an idea for a solution, to have it been checked and to listen openly to the professionals and to let all interest groups and interested people and so on to bring their ideas or the contrary ideas. And a process might take time, but the time is essential for a better solution. This is the responsibility, to have the best solutions. Sorry.
I want to go on to a topic that you spend a lot of time thinking about, which is corruption. And there are many questions around this, but to understand your thinking about how corruption has an impact on democracy, I need to understand your definition of corruption in this context.
Corruption has different definitions and is a little vague in its margins. But still, the common definition of corruption is that it's misuse of power, of political power, for private gains, even political gains sometimes on cost of the public good. So this is basically corruption. So it can be in the criminal sphere, in the ethical sphere. Not every criminal offense is corruption, and not every corruptive behavior is criminal. This has also to be understood. And in large, corruption is the misuse of power for private gain. And this is why it is so heavily connected with ethics, with our trust in the government, and with what I was trying to explain before, with a basic idea, our public interest in how government is supposed to work for the public interest.
But the issue here is that in a way, corruption is an issue between the voter and the elected officials, right? I mean, if they're doing their whatever they corrupt activities they do, it's against the people. And where does the public service come in protecting the voter from corruption?
If I was not clear, then I apologize.
Please.
But misuse of powers can be also by the public service. It's not only by politicians. And sadly enough, it does happen also that public officials and public servants are misusing their powers. We had just like a year ago understood that some high officials in the Ministry of Health were accepting bribes for letting food come into the country, imported food. We also see that some politicians are doing corrupt offenses, and some.
But when it comes to the legal to a proper criminal offense, it's easier because in a way, when they're caught, it renews the interest, the trust of the public in the system, right? Because justice is being made. What I'm more interested in here is in the grey issue of corrupt behavior that is not necessarily criminal, which you said exists.
It's true, but I want to first address the assumption you made that...
sorry, I was getting ahead of myself.
No, that's the name of the game. Criminal offense is supposed to be understood by the public as something that is wrong, and to reinsure our trust in the legal system and in the government, that here, whoever is rotten, we take out of the basket, the rotten apple. But sadly enough, it's not always like this. As we found in the last several years, hence the previous prime minister was accused in some criminal offense that is corruption and not other kinds of criminal offense. It had also a very disturbing effect on the idea of corruption as malpractice, because we could find that there is some groups in the public that had this idea that maybe corruption is not that bad if it affects our political leader. Maybe it is really, these are nonsense, these issues of accepting so-called presents that are not supposed to be accepted, when we might lose our excellent leader. So this idea of criminal behavior as something that is overall agreed, and corruption that is understood as something bad, is not always so, certain to stay with us. And we in the IDI are trying to figure out how to bring back to the public idea and understanding the very importance of the fight against corruption and the very importance of having a non-corrupt system, governmental system, as the interest of the people. Okay, so this is for your basic assumption. All in all, I tend to agree with you that criminal behavior is still a thing based on our very basic norms in society. But since corruption is also relating to the political sphere, there is some interrelations with political thoughts, and political understanding of the public. So we have to be careful about that. So now I can answer your question about the gray area. The gray area is really difficult to tackle. It's true. Ethics is basically difficult to tackle. What I'm trying to dwell into in my work is to look for the positive understanding of the importance of ethics and the ethos of the public service as a very basic notion that we want as a public to admire, okay, and that we need. And why do we need this public service ethos as a flag of the public service? How does it help us to accept like the better service and better governance for our interests as citizens and the services we accept from the government? What I found is that in the last several years, there's erosion of the public ethos and erosion of this ethos of the public service. It's the importance of its objectivity, professionalism, apoliticism, being non-partisan.
And do you think that erosion comes from the public service doing a bad job? Or do you think it comes from the fact that there has been this rather multi-year attack on that level of public service as something that is bad for politicians? And politicians have been saying that, the ones who've been in power, well, they're bad. They hold our policies back. So which is the cause of this erosion?
Basically, I think this heavy attack had very heavy prices on the ethos and the understanding of the positive value of public service. It is true, though, that public service has to be better continuously.
I agree.
Technology, for example, allows us to have better service, to have service on the net, to have quicker answers, and so on and so forth. And this is something that we have to have in mind all the time. We have to put budgets into that. The public service in Israel did not get, as far as I understand, enough budgets to improve itself continuously. For some years, part of this overall political attack, budgets were moved outside of the government to buy outside resources, like this constant improving of the government also requires budgets, requires attention. And government public service in Israel for some years lacked this attention and budgets for different reasons. Different services were bought from outsourcing professionals instead of strengthening the public service from within. I think these trends are now being changed. And for several years now, there are better ideas of how to strengthen the government from within and how to better technologies inside the government and use like computerized services and so on. So this, with the backing of politicians, of the importance of professionalism, can work together. Now, it's one with the other. Of course, if you don't put resources into the professional service, there are very good reasons to say that they are outdated, they don't have new ideas, they don't want to hear, they don't like risks, they are...
Yes, you've been writing a lot about this and thinking about this issue for a long time. And I'd like to ask you, is it because you think it's very serious? I mean, I wonder how endemic is all this, the threat to good governance and the erosion, the onset of corruption, these trends that you're talking about. Are we anywhere near the point of no return, or do you think that the public service and its norms is still robust in Israel?
I was thinking a lot about it, but I also bring a lot of experience to this and insights that I accumulated through along the years when I was in the civil service. One smart person once told me that, when you're young, all these high officials are far away from you. They look very smart. And as you get older and you get closer to them, you see that they're not that smart. But maybe those ones back then were not smart as well.
I personally don't think it's age. I just think it's proximity. How well you know them.
But still, I do think there's a profound change within the government that was affected because of different reasons. Part of them, these political interests in weakening the government and the public service that were very strong in the last decade. Also, there's international trends that affected Israel, we must admit. Trends that were, we can put them under the neoliberalism umbrella.
Do you mean in terms of the erosion of solidarity? What do you mean the effects of neoliberalism?
No, I mean the very strong emphasis on globalism, the very strong emphasis on the role of the corporates in the market, in the internal market. Like, it's very important to strengthen the economic market, which came in a way, was behind this better regulation efforts, smarter regulation efforts, in ways and emphasis that were more towards the economic parts of society and less towards the other interests of society.
Right. It sounds like exactly the process you mentioned before. Government cuts back on investment in the public sector. That's a neoliberal concept, a more austere state, outsources knowledge to, for computerization or whatever it is. And then as a result, the public sector suffers. That seems to me a kind of neoliberal trend. Once we used to call it conservative, right? Yeah. Just cutting down government and investing in the private sector. Is that part of what you're talking about?
Yes and no, because I think it affected also the idea of what the government role is towards society and what do citizens are supposed to expect the government to deliver. And in this sense, I think we're not, you were referring more to the bipartisan issues in the United States, conservative.
It's more thinking about how the labels start to overlap a little bit. Yeah. Between what we used to call conservative, we often just use the term neoliberal in a similar way. That's what I meant.
But I do think that in Israel it's a little different, and it affected the way we look at regulation. What is the role of regulation? And regulation is a very basic tool of government. Now, if regulation, as I see it, and I was within the government, the head of regulation, on top of regulation issues, if you see regulation as the basic tool of government to affect the markets, but to affect the markets delivering different answers to different interests, not only to the economic interest, then you bring in around the table to deal about the regulation all kind of interests and ideas, okay, and points of view. But if you think of regulation only as something that has to improve the market, then you talk only with the industry leaders. How do I connect it back to the main issue, the main questions that you were asking? You were asking whether I do see a profound change in the public sector in Israel. I saw a profound change that was affected by different political process that more came from the conservative part of the political system in Israel. that had in mind that the public service is too liberal and is interfering. When the public service was not more liberal than the basic values of the country as a democratic country. So in a way, this political idea was to narrow the democratic understanding or the democratic implementation of the government within the life of the citizens of Israel, or the implementation of government roles in the country. So this is one process. The other process that did affect the public service profoundly is an attempt of politicization of the public service. I guess we were dealing with it before in other talks, but there was a very strong intent to have political influence on choosing the professional, the high bureaucrats that are supposed to be highly professional.
Not just in the judiciary?
Not just in the judiciary.
But wouldn't the previous government just say, well, those senior levels of civil society, or of the public sector or the government, were already politically inclined, but in a way that we disagree with? Wouldn't they say that in the past they were just, let's just say what we're talking about. In this country, the previous government would have said, but all those positions in the past were already politically colored left. We're not doing anything new. We're just reflecting the fact that we are a right-wing government.
The right-wing governments are we're basically in power for 40 years already. And, high officials do not stay in power so long. So this is very strange to say this. And I think the change was more part of this, what we called populist trend. It's not the right time now. We don't have the time to dwell into that. But there was a start of a populist trend in the last decade in Israel. And part of this populist trend was to try and nominate people that are more right-winged and less democratic valued bureaucrats to positions that will work together alongside the populist leader more easily. And I think this is a difference. I can say that the right-wing Likud party that ruled since 1977 for most of the 40 years since basically brought into the system this idea of nominating high officials on a non-political basis. It's funny. I have to put brackets and refer to this idea that we are just doing what was done before. The last, let's say, maybe 20, 30 years of the State of Israel was ruled by Mapai. We all know that.
The first
yeah.
The first one, yes.
30, first 30 years. Did I say last?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
It's okay.
First. And we all know that it is true that political nominations or the being close to the political party was part of the game. At least this is common knowledge. One of the ideas that the Likud brought with him, Menachem Begin at that time in 1977, was to clean this atmosphere, to have a professional sphere of the public service. And these were good ideas that were also, implemented in law. Part of the rule of law that was very much developed since then was not having conflict of interests, was having this apolitical, very professional public service. And then in the last decade, because of these different process, whenever there was criticism against these ideas of having political nominations and all that, the first 2-3 decades of the government of Israel was suddenly rose back again. Why not referring to 1977? Why not referring to the 80s? Why not referring to the 90s? It's very easy to go back to Ben Gurion when it's easy. But
when it serves you.
Yeah, when it serves you. So I close the brackets of that. I just have to answer your question
about the erosion.
About the erosion. The third idea that I find was very much influential, except for these two that I already mentioned, is this approach that we have to have the markets work freely with competition, and we have to help the markets. The government is interfering with the markets. And this idea was brought in a sense that came at the expense of the other interests of civil society, that, as far as I understand, part of a democracy is to take them into account, and at least to take them into account, also to, I expect, to prevent damaging them, like environment concerns and helping the weaker parts of society, minorities, pluralism, and so on and so forth.
Right. It reminds me the way that it's when you said that the public servants were just reflecting the core values of Israel as a democracy. It reminded me of what Stephen Colbert, the American satirist, used to say, that it's well known that reality has a left-wing bias. Anyway, Edna Harel-Fischer, researcher at the IDI, thank you very much for joining us today for this second interview at the Tel Aviv Review podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
And many thanks to Itai Shalom, our station manager, and Ariel Cohen, our producer, as well as the Israel Democracy Institute, for their generous support. And now we've got a request, because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review of any kind. We'll be happy to read your thoughts. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has well over 600 interviews. And if you like us here, like us on Facebook. And don't forget to follow me and Dalia and the Tel Aviv Review podcast now on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.